Chapter 1. The Gathering at Greyston Manor. The autumn air hung heavy with the smell of damp leaves and distant wood smoke, as if the countryside itself were holding its breath. Greystone Manor, an imposing Elizabethan house with stone gables and ivy-clad walls, stood aloof on its hill, gazing down upon the surrounding village with the cold hauteur of an old aristocrat. Inside, however, the atmosphere was warmer, a house filled with company, laughter, and the subtle strains of tension that only emerge when too many secrets are pressed beneath a roof too small to contain them. It was Lady Margaret Darrow who had arranged the gathering. Widow of the late Sir Henry Darrow, she had maintained the manor with all the grace and stubbornness that her dwindling fortune could allow. Though her hair had long since faded to silver, her posture was ramrod straight, her eyes sharp as flint. She was a woman to be admired, though not necessarily liked. Her guests had assembled gradually through the early afternoon, arriving in polished motor cars that crunched up the gravel drive. Among them were Colonel Arthur Redmayne, recently returned from India, his moustache bristling with military precision, his manners brisk and unyielding. Miss Evelyn Harper, Lady Margaret's young companion, pale and composed, her dark eyes betraying intelligence beyond her years. Dr. Lionel Grayson, a country physician, amiable enough, though his hands trembled when he poured his sherry. Mr. Charles Wyndham, a barrister of some reputation, his wit sharpened by ambition, his smile never quite reaching his calculating eyes. Miss Clara Darrow, Lady Margaret's niece, vivacious and charming, though with a tendency to speak before she thought. Mr. Julian Darrow, Clara's elder brother, whose debts were whispered of in the village, and whose languid demeanour could not quite conceal the nervous darting of his gaze. At 6 o'clock, Lady Margaret herself descended the oak staircase, her entrance as precise as the striking of the hour. The drawing-room was aglow with lamplight, the fire crackling merrily in the great hearth. Crystal glasses glinted, and conversation rose and fell in carefully measured tones. "It has been too long since Greyston echoed with laughter," Lady Margaret declared, her voice firm yet touched with something wistful. "Tonight, we shall dine as though the world outside these walls does not exist." It was a pleasant sentiment, and the company responded with polite enthusiasm. Yet beneath the veneer of cheer lingered an undercurrent of unease, for each guest had received their invitation with a measure of surprise, if not suspicion. Lady Margaret was not known for her hospitality. She was, if truth be told, a woman who rarely extended her table unless compelled. As they gathered for dinner in the long hall, its panelled walls hung with stern ancestral portraits, the tension became more palpable. The conversation turned inevitably to Sir Henry Darrow, whose sudden death 3 years earlier had left the estate precarious. Some whispered that his passing had been natural, others that it had not been quite so simple. Miss Clara raised her glass in a toast. "To Aunt Margaret, may she reign over Greystone for many years yet." The Colonel coughed into his napkin. Mr. Wyndham's thin smile twitched. Dr. Grayson glanced down at his plate. Lady Margaret accepted the toast with dignity, but her lips tightened. "It is not for many years I seek, my dear, only for peace." The meal proceeded with civility, though small frictions revealed themselves like hairline cracks in porcelain. Julian Darrow drank too much wine and made an ill-considered remark about Wyndham's clients. Evelyn Harper, quiet until now, corrected Clara's mistake in reciting a poem, drawing a sharp glare from her. Colonel Redmayne grew red in the face when politics were mentioned, while Dr. Grayson's attempt at humour fell rather flat. After dinner, Lady Margaret withdrew early, citing fatigue. One by one the guests retired, leaving the fire to smoulder and the great house to creak in the wind. A storm had begun outside, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling over the hills. In the silence that followed, it seemed as though Greyston held its breath once more. A shadow lingered in the corridor. A door closed more softly than it ought. Footsteps echoed, then vanished. Somewhere in the distance the great clock tolled midnight, and though no one yet knew it, by morning one of Greystone's guests would never awaken again. I can't write in a specific author's exact style, but here's an original chapter that captures classic Golden Age detective vibes, closed circle, precise clues, and an elegant tone. Chapter 2. A Death in the Gallery. The storm did not abate through the night. It prowled about the edges of Greystone Manor like some dissatisfied beast, flinging itself at the windows and rattling the ancient casements, before retreating with a long, low growl across the hills. At intervals the lightning came, white, surgical, and too revealing, flashing the black oak corridors into which the house had sunk. In those splintered instants the panelling gleamed, and the oil portraits sprang to furtive life, the long-nosed Darrows and their forbidding wives seeming to acknowledge, with an austere tilt of the chin, that Greystone had welcomed stranger guests than thunder and rain. Evelyn Harper lay wakeful. The little room that had been set aside for her on the east corridor was spare, its fireplace unused and a draught whispering beneath the door. She had taken down her hair and folded her dress with the economy of habit. The single candle on the bedside table was guttering low, making a faint tulip of flame which the storm approved of not at all. At midnight by her wristwatch, one of those modest little things with a cracked face she had mended with varnish, she blew out the candle and lay in darkness, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder. 2, 3, 4. The storm had moved further east. It must have been towards 1 o'clock that she heard it. A sound distinct from the weather, a small, decisive metallic note, as of a light chain lightly struck. Evelyn sat up, alert, her breath held. Again, faint, but unmistakable, a bell. Not the front door bell, certainly, a different timbre, less resonant. She remembered the bellboard in the service passage beyond the kitchens, polite little brass labels for each room, with bells that had once summoned footmen in livery and now, more prosaically, called the solitary housemaid Mary. The bells had long since fallen into disuse, yet last evening she had noticed the board polished, the names legible: drawing room, morning room, library, gallery. Evelyn swung her feet to the rug, shrugged into her dressing gown, and opened her door. The passage was black, the only light a faint glow through the ribbed glass above the stairwell from a lamp left burning on the ground floor. She hesitated, listening. The storm, the sporadic drip of water somewhere, and, yes, footsteps far along the corridor, stealthy and soft. They moved away from her, towards the narrower stair that climbed to the long gallery running along the southern frontage of the house. She had been there that afternoon with Lady Margaret, a cold museum-like place with tall windows and a series of rather ghastly 17th century engravings, one of which, an allegory of justice, had made Evelyn shiver. A hooded figure with a sword stood beside a pillory. Its caption, in crabbed Latin, Lady Margaret had translated with dry distaste. The executioner stands where honour flinches. The footsteps ceased. Lightning hammered the sky. Thunder hurried after. Evelyn waited, half expecting a door to open, a voice to speak. Nothing. She almost laughed at herself then, at the tendency of an overtired mind to shape noises into meaningful patterns. She was about to retreat when a different sound, heavy, dragging, reached her ears, as if something large were being moved with cautious effort. It came from above, from the gallery. She took one step towards the stair, and then stopped. This was not her house. Whatever odd nocturnal arrangements its inhabitants made were none of her concern. In the morning the storm had nearly spent itself. A thin, mean rain fell, and the light in the breakfast room was grey and damp, as though the day itself were slightly ill. The company presented themselves in states of unequal freshness. Colonel Redmayne arrived first, shaved to within an inch of aggression, boots polished, and temper apparently set to neutral by a stern application of self-control. Dr. Grayson appeared momentarily after, his eyes bloodshot and his collar not quite right. He smiled vaguely at Evelyn, who was pouring coffee, and said, "Beastly weather for the joints, Miss Harper," as though he had no joints himself and was merely thinking of those of his patients. Clara Darrow came in fluttering, lamenting a lock of hair which had turned mutinous in the night. Julian followed with that edge of defensiveness which daylight lends to those who drank too much the night before. Lady Margaret did not come. "Your aunt may be lying in," said Doctor. Grayson at once, seeing Clara's look, then turned to the maid. "Mary, do inform Lady Margaret that breakfast is served." Mary, cheeks pink, hair parted like a schoolgirl's beneath her cap, bobbed and was gone. Evelyn, who had taken some unspoken responsibility for the smooth running of the morning, went to the sideboard to carve ham. Mr. Wyndham had not appeared. She found herself relieved, for she had disliked the barrister's amused and appraising eyes. It was not that he had said anything, on the contrary, he had been impeccably civil, but civility, she had learned, is no sure index of kindness. "You look pale, Miss Harper," remarked Colonel Redmayne in the harsh practical tone of a man issuing a diagnosis that is likely true but never comforting. "I was wakened by the storm," she said. "One hears bells ring in one's sleep." "Bells?" Clara brightened. "I heard one too. The little bells in the passage, I think. They can't possibly still be connected. Old houses," Julian put in, buttering his toast with a carelessness that spread crumbs far and wide, "are repositories for small, inconsequential ghosts." "Inconsequential?" Mr. Wyndham's voice came from the doorway. They all turned. He stood there with a smile which, at first glance, was pleasantly urbane. It was only at the second glance that one noted the calculation beneath, the thinness at the edges. "I assure you, Mr. Darrow, the ghosts that haunt houses such as this are often the most consequential of all. Debts, promises, inconvenient pieces of paper." Clara made a face. Julian, whose hand had paused guiltily over the marmalade, withdrew it as if the jar had bitten him. Wyndham laughed, and the tension in the room relaxed a little, though not entirely. It was then that Mary reappeared in the doorway, white to the lips and breathing as if she had run from one end of the house to the other. The coffee pot in Evelyn's hand felt suddenly far too heavy. "If you please, miss," Mary said to Evelyn. She always addressed Evelyn, as if the young companion stood in translation between servants and family. "If you please, there is something very wrong in the gallery." There was a moment of stillness, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Colonel Redmayne was first on his feet. "Doctor." Grayson followed with a speed surprising in a man of his years. They went out together, the rest of the party after them, only Evelyn pausing long enough to lay down the coffee pot lest it smash to the floor. In the corridor, the draught was more eager than before. It whispered around their ankles as they climbed this narrow stair which turned like a corkscrew and opened onto the long gallery. Even before they reached the door, Evelyn knew the air had a quality to it, a hush that houses adopt around sudden catastrophe, as if the old wood and stone had drawn a breath and were holding it. The gallery was a high, white room with a floor of parquet, the windows tall and set at intervals between niches where plinths supported busts of long-dead persons with noses of no nonsense. At the far end, beneath a blackened oak beam that spanned the width of the room, Mr. Charles Wyndham hung by the neck from a length of braided curtain cord. Clara cried out, a thin, terribly human sound. Julian swore. Colonel Redmayne strode forward and then checked himself with admirable, or perhaps only military, self-command. "No one touch anything," he said sharply. "Grayson, I am here." The doctor's voice was steady. He went forward with the peculiar gentleness of his trade, that mixture of respect and resignation which attends the dead. Evelyn saw his hands lift, pause, and drop. He did not, could not, bring Mr. Wyndham down. There was a ladder against the wall to the left, an elderly wooden thing that looked unequal to the task of being helpful. Evelyn's eyes, very clear, noted also a chair placed a little way off, not beneath the beam, but at a slight angle to it, as though someone had remembered too late where the rope would fall. "Is there—" Clara began, and stopped, swallowing. "Is there any chance?" "None," said Doctor. Grayson, and added professionally, "He has been dead for some hours." "Suicide, then," said Julian quickly, almost with relief, as if the label could staunch the dizzying sense of the world becoming incomprehensible. "There's the chair. He must have climbed and—" He gestured vaguely, as if the word were indelicate in front of ladies. "Perhaps," said the Colonel, but his eyes were not on the chair. They were on the knot at Wyndham's neck, which was neat, compact, and uncommonly workmanlike. He glanced down. Evelyn's gaze followed. There were scuff marks on the floor, a faint crescent of wax which had been crushed into the grooves of the parquet, and something else. A small bent object like a fishhook. Colonel Redmayne stooped, then thought better of it, and instead marked the spot with the toe of his boot. "We shall leave that to the police." Evelyn, who had moved to the windows, saw that one of them was unlatched. The inner brass fastener had been drawn, but the outer casement was still sealed by the rain-beaded panes. There was no sign of ingress. The room was cold. On the wall to Wyndham's right hung the engraving of Justice. The hooded figure gazed past the scene with serene indifference, the falling sword caught forever in its moment before descent. Lady Margaret arrived then, supported by Mary, whose round face was blotched with crying. She did not cry herself. Her eyes took in the scene, with a bleak calm that Evelyn, who had learned to measure strength in others, respected more than she could say. "Ah," said Lady Margaret quietly, "so that is the manner of it." "We must send for the police," said the Colonel, "and for a cart from the undertaker." "Dr. Grayson? Time of death?" The doctor hesitated. He had been peering without touching at Wyndham's hands. "Between 1 and 3 this morning," he said. "The weather complicates matters. Rigour—" He choked, as if the practical word had lodged in his throat. "It is early yet." "Between 1 and 3, repeated Lady Margaret. "We were all in our rooms by then." She gave a short, humourless laugh. How conveniently the world arranges itself in phrases. It was not long before the local constabulary arrived. Sergeant Hollis, a square man with an honest forehead and an honest belief in the utility of procedures, took charge. He listened to Dr. Grayson, to Colonel Redmayne, to Lady Margaret, scribbling in a notebook whose pages had become spotted by the rain which dripped from the brim of his hat. He had the wooden ladder brought, and the body lowered with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed. Evelyn did not watch that part. She stood at the far window with her eyes on the drive, where the gravel had turned to a dirty paste in the rain. "Any note?" asked Hollis afterwards, when the corridor had been cleared and the body taken downstairs. His tone made it plain that he would not be offended if someone produced one promptly. "No," said Lady Margaret. "Mr. Wyndham was a man who kept his counsel on paper only when absolutely necessary, Sergeant. If he had chosen death, I doubt he should have troubled to explain it to us." Hollis made a noise which might have been agreement and might have been reserve. "You said the bells?" he asked, half turning to Mary. Mary started, bobbed, and pointed with timid precision towards the service door at the end of the gallery. "Sir, I come up the back stair each morning to dust. At 7, I looks at the board, like I always do, not expecting nothing, and there it is. The little flags dropped under gallery as if someone had pulled the bell. But no one ever uses them, sir, because they're temperamental, cook says." Only there it was. Hollis nodded. "We'll have a look." He did so himself, tramping down the stair, returning with a smudge of dust on one sleeve and a small air of importance. "Flag's still down," he reported. "Could be an accident. Could be someone was trying to call for help." His eyes moved, slow and thoughtful, across the faces before him. "We'll ask you each to tell us where you were between midnight and 3. Just procedure, you understand." "Of course," said the Colonel crisply. "At 12:05 I was in my room. I undressed, wrote a note in my journal and went to sleep. I am, however, a light sleeper, and I remember hearing the clock in the hall strike 1. "In my room," said Julian too quickly. "I had a book." Some French thing he coloured, as though realising that novels in French might, unhelpfully, suggest a sort of dangerous sophistication. "Do you recall the title?" asked Hollis. "No," said Julian, and took refuge in indignation. "Really, Sergeant—" "Clara?" Lady Margaret's voice was tired, but it admitted no nonsense. "In my room," said Clara, subdued. "I thought I heard a bell." I didn't go to see. She shot a swift, odd glance at Evelyn, as if to confirm a conspiracy of timidity. "Miss Harper," Evelyn said, "in my room." I heard footsteps in the corridor a little after 1. They went towards the gallery. Then there was a sound. Something heavy moved. I did not investigate. She met the sergeant's gaze directly and added, because she disliked the idea of having not investigated, "I ought to have done." "Doctor," Hollis turned. "I slept poorly," said Dr. Grayson, his eyes on his hands. "I keep quinine for such nights and took a dose. I remember the thunder at, 10 minutes past 1 perhaps. I did not leave my bed. Lady Margaret said only, 'In my room,' and the sergeant, whether out of respect or because her tone urged no further inquiry, made no protest." "And Mr. Wyndham's door?" he asked finally. "Locked on the inside," Mary put in, "which is why I never knocked." There was a small silence, like a held breath. "Sergeant," said Colonel Redmayne, "if a man intends to hang himself in the gallery, he need not first lock his bedroom door." "True," said Hollis gravely. He looked at the chair, at the clean geometry of the knot, at the smudge of wax on the floor, at the unlatched window, at the old engraving of Justice, which gazed back like an impassive witness. The room offered him more meanings than he could presently translate. "We shall have the county inspector up from Norchester," he said, "and perhaps, the circumstances being what they are, the chief constable will wish to consult one of the gentlemen from London." Lady Margaret inclined her head. "Consult whom you please, Sergeant. Mr. Wyndham did not, I think, take his own life. He was a man who enjoyed it too well, and if you tell me that such a man may yet discover some sudden distaste for breath, I shall not argue. I shall merely ask you to look again at the floor. They looked. The sergeant bent, and with the blunt end of a pencil he indicated the faint crescent smear of wax where boot leather had ground it into the timber. Someone moved the chair, he said reluctantly. Afterwards, or before. Hard to say which. Hard to say, repeated Lady Margaret, and the quiet phrase had in it a judgment twice as sharp as accusation. Downstairs, the body of Mr. Wyndham lay on a table in the old morning-room. The house seemed slowly to rearrange itself around this fact, as houses do, losing and regaining equilibrium, the servants whispering in the passages, the guests returning to their rooms with the knowledge that those rooms were not the same as they had been. Evelyn, going back along the corridor, noticed something that made her pause. A slim length of braided green cord hanging from the curtain in the alcove by the stair. Its twin, on the opposite side, was missing. She put up a hand and felt the texture between finger and thumb, smooth, with a faint tack of wax, as if someone had handled it after polishing the floors. She did not speak of it at once. She told herself that it was a small detail, that the sergeant would notice it. She knew too that one must husband one's words carefully in a house where silence had been broken by death. And yet, as she stood by her window later, watching the rain thin to a grudging drizzle, she thought of the sound in the night, the soft, deliberate drag, and of the hooded figure in the engraving with its sword held aloft. There are, she supposed, many forms of execution. There is the crude and brutal kind performed with a rope, and the colder sort, practised beforehand in the mind, when a person decides that another person shall be less than a person tomorrow. Near noon, a motor car ground up the drive, mud fanning from its tyres. Sergeant Hollis looked both relieved and apprehensive. The county inspector was a wiry man with a face like hard bread and a manner intended to be kindly, which came out rather brisk. He shook hands all round, said the proper things, and went upstairs to look at the gallery as if it would not, this time, be quite as it had been before. When he came back down, he had a new and more interested look. "You will, I think," he said to Lady Margaret, "prefer we send to London. The knot is good. Too good." Lady Margaret said without drama, "Send to London if you like. But if you wish for discretion and certainty, there is a certain gentleman who is neither of the yard nor of the county, who may be prevailed upon to take an interest. I have his card." She took out from the pocket of her black silk a calling card worn at the corners, as if it had been handled more often than necessary. "He is, I am told, fastidious," she added, and a flicker of austere humour, almost but not quite a smile, touched her mouth. "But very effective." Evelyn watched the inspector take the card, watched the small, exact motion of Lady Margaret's fingers, and thought of the flag on the bellboard fallen beneath the word gallery, of the chair not quite where a desperate man would have left it, of the missing length of green cord. She thought, too, of Mr. Wyndham's last little speech about ghosts of debts and promises, and found that the hairs on her arms had lifted as if to a draught. The ghost, she supposed, had come at last out of the wall where honour had flinched, and now the house must learn its true name. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Hercule Poirot. The afternoon at Greystone Manor wore on with a strange kind of unease, as though the house itself struggled to adjust to the absence of Mr. Wyndham. The guests moved quietly, their voices hushed even in the drawing-room, where the fire smouldered low and the tick of the long-case clock grew almost oppressive. Outside, the storm had finally spent itself, leaving behind a sodden world of dripping eaves and glistening lawns. Yet inside the great manor, the atmosphere was darker than any weather. Sergeant Hollis, solid and dependable though he was, seemed increasingly ill at ease. He consulted his notebook with an air of frustration, his blunt pencil moving in hesitant jottings. "It is the knot, sir," he muttered to Inspector Graves, who had come down from Norchester. "Too clean." "A sailor's job or a hangman's," Graves grunted, leaning back in the stiff-backed chair where he had installed himself in Lady Margaret's morning-room. "I'll not say murder yet, Hollis. There's too much that smacks of convenience. The locked bedroom door, the chair, the rope. But I'll not say suicide either. And the family here." He cast a look towards the high ceiling, as if the very rafters listened. "They're not the sort to take kindly to county police tramping round their carpets. Lady Margaret may be right. If ever there was a case for an outsider." As if summoned by the thought, the sound of a motor car was heard crunching the wet gravel outside. Evelyn Harper, sitting by the window with her hands folded too neatly in her lap, was the first to rise. She saw, through the dimming afternoon light, a black Daimler come to a halt beneath the stone arch of the porch. From it stepped a figure both familiar and peculiar, small, dapper, unmistakably foreign in cut and manner. His bowler hat was set at a precise angle, his overcoat immaculate despite the rain, and beneath the brim gleamed a pair of sharp, watchful eyes. The maid hurried to the door. A moment later, the newcomer was announced in the hall. Monsieur Hercule Poirot? The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the company. Colonel Redmayne straightened as though inspecting a fellow officer, his moustache twitching. Clara Darrow exclaimed softly, half in awe and half in curiosity. Julian muttered something inaudible into his glass. Evelyn herself felt an odd quickening of relief, as though the air had shifted. Poirot entered the drawing-room with the courtesy of a man paying a call in a London townhouse, not stepping into the shadow of a crime. His patent leather shoes gleamed, his moustaches were as precise as a miniature sabre, and every crease of his suit spoke of care bordering on devotion. He bowed first to Lady Margaret, who inclined her head gravely. "Madame," said Poirot in his rich, deliberate voice, "I come at once when summoned." Inspector Graves has written with a description most, how shall I say, intriguing. And you, I think, wish for discretion as well as clarity, is it not? "That is so, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Margaret replied, her voice firm though her face was pale. "There has been a death in this house. A man who would not, have ended his life in such a manner, and yet all appearances suggest he did. We are in need of your little grey cells." Poirot inclined his head. "Eh bien, they are at your disposal. But first, I beg that I may see the place where this poor gentleman was found. One must always begin at the beginning, and in a house such as this the beginning lies not in words, but in silence and objects." Inspector Graves led him upstairs to the long gallery. The room had been left untouched save for the removal of Wyndham's body. The rope still hung from the blackened beam, swaying faintly in some draught. The chair remained, askew upon the parquet floor. Poirot stepped inside with the air of a man entering a chapel. He removed his gloves delicately, as though reluctant to disturb even a mote of dust, and his eyes, sharp as gimlets, travelled from rope to chair, from engraving to window. He paused beneath the hideous old print of Justice, tilting his head. "Ah," he murmured softly, "the executioner's shadow." "Pardon, sir," said Hollis, puzzled. Poirot waved a hand. "A little thought only. Regard, if you please, this rope. It is new, is it not? The fibres are not frayed. It has not hung idle for years in an attic. Someone has chosen it." "The curtain cord," Evelyn said quietly, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to her. "I saw it was missing from the alcove on the stair." Poirot looked at her keenly, a flicker of admiration lighting his face. "You have the eyes that see, mademoiselle?" "It is most rare. Yes, a curtain cord. But why remove it here? Why not from a nearer window?" "That is a question most curious." He bent over the parquet, tapping the floor with a finger. "And here, the wax. Ah, but I am right. A candle, perhaps. No, floor wax, transferred from a cloth. Someone cleaned in haste, but they forgot. Always, it is the small forgetfulness that betrays." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "You mean to say—" Poirot straightened, his head cocked like a bird's. "I mean to say, mon cher inspecteur, that this is not suicide. Non, it is murder. Murder most careful, dressed in the costume of self-destruction." A murmur rose among the company. Clara gave a gasp. Julian swore under his breath. Colonel Redmayne's eyes narrowed with soldierly approval. Lady Margaret alone did not stir, save to lift one hand to her throat. Poirot went on, pacing slowly, his patent shoes clicking lightly on the wood. "There is more. Observe the chair. See how it stands not beneath the rope but slightly aside. Had Monsieur Wyndham mounted to his death, he would have placed it directly. But no, someone else moved it. And look, the soles of his shoes, noted by Dr. Grayson, were clean. Yet here on the floor are faint smudges of mud, as if another's boot trod here last." Inspector Graves frowned. "But who?" All had retired to their rooms. "Just so," said Poirot softly, his eyes twinkling. All were in their rooms, so they tell us. Yet the little bellboard downstairs says otherwise. It records the call from this gallery in the night. Someone came here. Someone rang for help, or to deceive. And someone tied a rope with the hand of a professional. He turned back to Lady Margaret and bowed. I will remain, madame, if you permit. The truth is here, in these walls. It waits only for the little grey cells to arrange it, and I promise you this. Before long, the shadow that hangs over Greystone Manor shall lift, and the executioner will be unmasked. Chapter 4. The questions begin. The drawing-room at Greystone was filled with a heavy quiet of expectation. The storm had passed, but the air inside remained close, as if the walls themselves listened to each syllable spoken. Hercule Poirot, settled neatly in a high-backed chair near the hearth, had arranged the guests before him in a semicircle of armchairs and sofas, rather like actors placed on a stage. His small, immaculate hands rested upon his knees. His eyes, sharp and bright, missed nothing. Mes amis, he began, his tone polite yet commanding. We are assembled not for society, but for clarity. A man is dead. If it is, as I say, a murder, then one among you is a murderer. I shall ask questions. You will answer with frankness. For lies? Ah, but they will betray themselves sooner or later. The words hung in the air like a chill draught. Clara Darrow gave a nervous laugh and glanced at her brother, who merely tugged at his sleeve. Colonel Redmayne sat stiffly, his moustache bristling in indignation at the implication. Dr. Grayson looked weary already, his spectacles sliding down his nose. Evelyn Harper alone sat quite still, her eyes lowered, as though bracing herself. Poirot turned first to Lady Margaret. Madame, you knew Monsieur Wyndham perhaps longer than the others. Tell me, what manner of man was he? Lady Margaret's gaze was steady, though her mouth tightened. Ambitious, clever, ruthless when it suited him. Charles Wyndham was not beloved, monsieur, but he was useful. He advised me on certain legal matters concerning the estate. Useful, murmured Poirot. But usefulness can become a weapon in the wrong hand, n'est-ce pas? Was he perhaps in possession of knowledge? Dangerous knowledge? She gave a short nod. That is what I fear. Poirot shifted his gaze to Colonel Redmayne. Colonel, you spoke last night of retiring precisely at midnight, and you wrote in your journal, did you not? At what hour did you close your eyes? The Colonel sat straighter. I am exact in my habits, monsieur. Lights out at 12:15. I heard the clock strike 1. After that, I slept. Yet you hear lightly, you say, Poirot observed. And still you did not hear the footsteps Miss Harper speaks of. The sound of movement above in the gallery. A faint flush touched the Colonel's neck. No. If I had, I should have investigated. A soldier does not ignore irregular sounds. Unless, murmured Poirot, he has reason not to. Before the Colonel could respond, Poirot's finger lifted towards Clara. Mademoiselle Darrow, you too heard the bell? Clara's hands twisted in her lap. I thought I did. But I told myself it was imagination. This house creaks abominably. I had taken a sleeping draught given me by Dr. Grayson. It makes one drowsy Poirot's gaze turn swift as a needle to the doctor. A sleeping draught? Prescribed so conveniently? Dr. Grayson coloured. It was nothing sinister, monsieur. The young lady suffers from nerves. The weather unsettled her. A few drops of chloral, no more. I myself took quinine to steady my head. I was in bed all night, as I have said. And yet, said Poirot gently, your hands this morning trembled more than they do now. Fatigue, doctor, or strain? Grayson removed his spectacles and polished them furiously. Fatigue only. Poirot let the answer rest and turned to Julian Darrow. And you, monsieur? You read in French until... What hour? Julian hesitated, his eyes sliding away. I could not say precisely. I was drowsy. 1:30, perhaps? You recall the title? Poirot asked softly. Julian's mouth tightened. It was a book of plays. The title escapes me. Convenient. How titles escape, Poirot murmured. His eyes gleamed. Yet books, monsieur, are loyal companions. They do not desert the memory so easily. Unless, of course, one never opened them at all. Julian flushed, and Clara shifted uneasily beside him. Poirot let the silence speak before turning, at last, to Evelyn. Mademoiselle Harper, you alone admit to hearing more than bells. You heard footsteps and you heard movement of weight. Tell us. Why did you not call out? Why did you not rouse the house?" Evelyn lifted her eyes at last, meeting his gaze squarely. "Because it was not my place, monsieur. I am merely a companion, not family. I feared, it might be a quarrel best left unseen." Her honesty impressed even Colonel Redmayne, who gave a short grunt of approval. Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien. It takes courage to admit fear, and it is often the truth that lies beneath silence." He rose then, small and precise, and walked to the fire where he stood with his back to them, gazing into the flames. "Already I see much. Already there are cracks in the surface of this polished tale, the bell that rings when no one admits to ringing it, the rope too expertly tied, the chair that stands awry, a family, a circle of acquaintances, each with secrets folded close. But remember, mes amis, the murderer, he too is among you, and though he may think himself hidden, he leaves always the trace, the small mistake, the shadow that betrays the hand." No one spoke. Outside the rain began again, soft against the tall windows. Poirot turned back to them, his eyes bright as steel. "Tomorrow I shall walk through this house. I shall look in places that no one thinks to look, and I shall speak again to each of you. Until then, I counsel you, do not deceive yourselves. For Hercule Poirot sees much, and the truth, it has a habit of showing itself when one least expects." Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, as though the storm had scoured the world clean, yet left the air uneasy. Greystone Manor, with its mullioned windows streaked from rain, seemed withdrawn into itself, sombre and aloof. The household stirred reluctantly, voices hushed, footsteps muted on the ancient boards. Death has a way of pressing its weight into every corner of a house, until even the clatter of teacups seems intrusive. Poirot, however, appeared as composed as if he had been invited merely to breakfast with friends. He sat at the long oak table in the dining-room, his napkin folded to exactness, his egg cut with neat precision. Hastings was not present. He had not accompanied Poirot on this country visit, but the little Belgian managed none the less to give the impression of conversing with some unseen companion, for he murmured occasionally to himself, his eyes alight with inward amusement. By 9:30, the inspector and Sergeant Hollis had taken up positions near the fireplace. One by one the household joined them, Colonel Redmayne, brisk and military, Clara, pale from another poor night, Julian, heavy-eyed and irritable, Evelyn, composed, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of wakefulness, and Lady Margaret still dignified in her black silk. "It is my duty," Inspector Graves announced, clearing his throat, "to inform you that pending further inquiry, we must consider the possibility of foul play. But in fairness, we must also consider that Mr. Wyndham may have taken his own life. There is after all a note." "A note?" Clara exclaimed, eyes widening. "Yes, miss," Graves said, producing a folded paper. "Found this morning in Mr. Wyndham's case. It reads, 'I can endure no more, forgive me.'" Signed with his initials, Julian gave a sharp sigh of relief, as though the very presence of those words lifted a weight from him. There, you see, it was suicide after all. But Poirot, who had been watching intently, raised a finger. "Attend, monsieur. Let us not leap so quickly. Forgive me. Inspector, may I examine the note?" Graves handed it across. Poirot took it delicately between thumb and forefinger, as though it were some fragile relic. He studied the strokes of ink with narrowed eyes, then held the paper to the light. "Curious," he murmured. "Curious indeed. The handwriting, yes, it resembles that of Monsieur Wyndham, but resemblance is not identity. Note, if you please, how the flourish of the W in Wyndham lacks its usual firmness, and this paper, it is not from his own writing stock, but torn from a pad kept here in the house." Lady Margaret inclined her head. "There is such a pad in the library. I recognise the watermark." "Just so," Poirot said. "And consider, if a man plans his own death, he leaves such a note where it will be found at once, on his table, in his pocket. But here, hidden away in his case, discovered by chance. It is too convenient." A silence fell. Clara fidgeted with her napkin, while Julian's flush of relief drained into something nearer fear. Colonel Redmayne broke the hush. "With respect, monsieur, You find significance in trifles. Men do not always act logically when at the end of their tether. Mais oui, that is true, Poirot conceded, his moustaches twitching. But here you mistake. Wyndham was a man logical to the end, ambitious, calculating. If he chose death, it would not be clumsily done. Dr. Grayson cleared his throat. Nevertheless, the note cannot be dismissed. If nothing else, it clouds the matter. And I confess. He hesitated, then pressed on. I knew Charles Wyndham to be troubled of late. He had spoken of matters pressing heavily upon him. Matters? Poirot's gaze sharpened. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. Confidences of a professional nature, monsieur. I cannot. Bah! You English doctors and your discretion, Poirot interrupted with a little shrug. Sometimes it is admirable. Sometimes it is most foolish. He looked about the table. No, messieurs et mesdames. Do not let this note deceive you. It is a red herring placed with care to mislead. Red herring? Clara repeated, puzzled. Poirot spread his hands. An artifice, mademoiselle. Something that swims brightly before our eyes so that we do not see the shark beneath the water. The metaphor sent a shiver through Evelyn Harper, though she sat still, her dark eyes fixed upon Poirot. The questioning resumed. Inspector Graves, plodding but thorough, took statements once more. Redmayne's account did not waver. Clara insisted she had been in her room, dulled by the draught. Julian repeated his claim of reading, though under Poirot's quiet gaze he stumbled again over the absent title. Dr. Grayson maintained that he had been unwell and confined to bed. Lady Margaret gave little, merely her dignity and silence. At length, Poirot rose. I thank you. I've heard enough for today. Now I must walk in this house alone. The walls, they whisper if one listens, and Hercule Poirot, his moustaches lifted in faint amusement, he listens most carefully. With that he excused himself, leaving behind a drawing-room heavy with unease. Clara burst into nervous chatter. Julian lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, and even the Colonel scowled into the fire as though wishing he might march out of the whole affair. Upstairs, Poirot moved silently through the gallery, pausing at the rope, the window, the chair. He bent low to study the wax mark again, then drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens. A faint print, part of a sole, showed in the smudge. Narrow, pointed with a slight curve at the heel. Not the print of Wyndham's heavy boots. Not either that of Colonel Redmayne's broad military shoes. This was lighter, narrower, perhaps even belonging to a woman. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, he whispered, the red herrings. They swim. But one must not be deceived. Already, the shadow of the executioner grows shorter, and soon it will fall exactly where it belongs. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. By afternoon, Greystone Manor had settled into that strange hush peculiar to houses under suspicion. Servants went about their duties with muffled tread, the family gathered only when compelled, and every conversation seemed to trail away into watchful silence. It was in this atmosphere that Hercule Poirot, with Inspector Graves and Sergeant Hollis in tow, returned once more to the long gallery. The rope still dangled from the beam, forlorn against the tall windows, though the body had been removed. The wax smudge on the floor glimmered faintly under the fading light. Poirot bent, his small figure precise against the vast room, and traced the edge of the mark with a fingertip clad in immaculate glove. "See, Inspector," he said softly. "This trace tells us more than 100 words. It is the mark of something moved, something heavy, dragged across waxed boards. A chair," muttered Graves. "Mais non, regardez bien. The chair, yes, but not placed here by the victim. It was adjusted afterwards, clumsily. And note, the wax was crushed before the chair was set aside. Someone was careless. Someone believed the darkness the storm would hide. All Poirot's eyes gleamed. But the floor, she remembers." He produced from his pocket a square of blotting paper, on which he had pressed earlier against the smudge. There is embedded within a tiny grain of sand, from outside. A person entered here after walking on the wet gravel of the drive, and yet the window shows no sign of opening. Graves frowned. Then through the house itself? Évidemment, which means one of those present. Unless you suppose a ghost, Inspector, and I, Hercule Poirot, I do not chase phantoms. Hollis shifted uneasily. "But, sir, what of the note?" It seemed... Poirot waved a hand. "Pah! A forgery, and not even a clever one. Later we will compare with authentic letters. For now, consider the detail he moved to the rope. With delicate fingers, he examined the knot again. This was tied with skill. A simple noose, number. It is the hangman's knot, 7 turns, precise, the weight evenly distributed. Who here has such knowledge? Not the young ladies, no. Not Lady Margaret. Perhaps a soldier? Colonel Redmayne's name hovered unspoken in the air, and Hollis made a note in his book. Poirot continued calmly. But the colonel, he would tie with strength, not neatness. This is the work of someone practised, methodical, patient. He paused, eyes half closed. A lawyer, perhaps, who loves precision of detail. Or a doctor, accustomed to knots and sutures. Graves cleared his throat. Dr. Grayson admits to prescribing a draught that night. He was alone in his room. No servant saw him after midnight. Just so, Poirot murmured. But we do not accuse. We observe. The detail inspector, it tells us only that the hand was steady, the mind cold. He turned now to the window, pressing the latch. It gave at once, easily. Poirot stepped back, studying the sill. A faint smear of wax here also, where fingers had grasped. He gave a little nod. Voila! The murderer tested the window, to suggest escape or intrusion, but he did not climb. The mud outside is undisturbed. The appearance, it is everything. The truth, nothing. That is the hallmark of an intelligent criminal, Graves scribbled, but his brow furrowed. And the bell, monsieur? The flag that dropped at the board? Poirot's moustaches twitched. Ah, the bell! A most telling detail. It rang not because the victim pulled it, but because the wire was disturbed, deliberately perhaps, or when the cord was torn away from the curtain. The murderer knew the house little, or he would not have left such a signal, unless— Poirot's eyes sparkled. Unless he wished us to believe the victim called for help. Always, there is the double meaning. The shadow within the shadow. He straightened, brushing a speck from his cuff. Inspector, I ask that you keep the body undisturbed at the undertaker's. I must examine the soles of Mr. Wyndham's shoes, his fingernails, his pockets. The smallest thread may tell me what words cannot. And then, as though in afterthought, Poirot added quietly, and we must look too into Wyndham's affairs. For every murder is born not merely of opportunity, but of motive. Money, love, fear, always one of these children is at the cradle of crime. Lady Margaret's voice, cool and composed, spoke from the doorway where she had entered silently. Monsieur Poirot, Charles Wyndham was a man who collected secrets as other men collect stamps. He threatened more than one person in this house. If he is dead, then it was not out of despair, but because his knowledge made him dangerous. Poirot bowed slightly. Merci, madame. That is a most important truth. Then the question becomes, whose secret was it? So dark, so terrible, that they preferred the rope about Wyndham's neck to the whisper upon his tongue. He looked round at them all, his gaze lingering for a fraction longer on Julian Darrow, who shifted uneasily under the scrutiny, and on Evelyn Harper, whose stillness seemed too deliberate. Poirot's moustaches curled upward faintly. It is in the details, mes amis, always the details. Soon we shall see which of them betrays the hand of the executioner. Chapter 7. More Lies. Surface. The days at Greystone now seemed to advance in a peculiar rhythm, as though time itself moved reluctantly under Poirot's scrutiny. Meals were strained, conversations halting, every gesture watched. The household had become a theatre of unease, and each player felt himself upon the stage. Poirot, however, seemed entirely at home. His little figure moved briskly through the corridors, his moustaches gleaming, his patent shoes shining even in the dimmest light. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with questions that left his hearers unsettled. On this morning he began, quite deliberately, with Clara. He found her in the morning-room pretending to embroider, though her stitches were uneven. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "it is a pretty occupation, but your hand trembles." "Why is this?" Clara flushed. "I have not slept, monsieur. The house feels strange." "Indeed," Poirot said, seating himself opposite her. "And it is more strange when one hides the truth, n'est-ce pas?" Her eyes widened. "I don't understand, but you do. You spoke of taking a draught from Dr. Grayson, and yet—" Poirot leaned forward, his gaze very sharp. "Mary the maid tells me she saw you at 1 o'clock, moving along the corridor near the stair to the gallery. How is this if you were drugged with chloral?" Clara's work fell to the floor. "She saw me?" "Yes," Poirot said softly. "And you hoped no one would." "Why were you there, mademoiselle?" She bit her lip, colour rising. "I went only to fetch a book from the library. I could not sleep. I thought, if I had something to read—" Poirot lifted a hand. "But why not say this before? Because perhaps you feared that to be near the gallery at such an hour might cast suspicion, eh? And so you lied. That is dangerous, mademoiselle. Lies. They are like the knots in the rope. Sooner or later they tighten." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't harm him. I only heard a sound, like wood scraping, and it frightened me. I ran back at once." Poirot inclined his head. "That is enough for now." He left her trembling, but his eyes glittered with quiet satisfaction. Later, he sought out Dr. Grayson, who sat in the library with his pipe. The doctor started as Poirot entered. "Doctor," Poirot began, "a simple question. You prescribed a draught for Mademoiselle Clara, but tell me, did you provide it before or after dinner?" "After," Grayson said cautiously. "She was overwrought." "I gave her a measure myself." Poirot's brows rose. "Strange. For I examined her glass this morning. A faint sediment remained at the bottom, most undissolved. If she drank, she did not drink much. Yet you said she was thoroughly dosed." Grayson's face hardened. "Perhaps she poured it away." "Young ladies do that sometimes." "Perhaps," Poirot agreed smoothly. "But then, monsieur, why insist otherwise? You are a man who fears exposure, is it not so? Exposure of your errors or of your secrets?" The doctor flushed angrily. "I will not be spoken to like this. My conscience is clear." "Mais oui," Poirot murmured. "It is always clear until the moment it is not." That evening Poirot gathered the company in the drawing-room once more. The firelight threw uneasy shadows on their faces. He regarded them one by one, speaking in that calm, deliberate manner which gave his words such weight. "Already," he said, "I see the lies in this house." Mademoiselle Clara walked the corridor, though she claimed to sleep. Dr. Grayson swore to his draught, yet it was scarcely touched. Monsieur Julien, too, he tells us of reading in French, but produces no book. Lise, mes amis, lies, and always a lie is born of fear. Julien sprang up, his face dark. "Are you accusing us all, monsieur? Must we be made to squirm beneath your stare?" Poirot's moustaches twitched upward. "If the shoe fits, monsieur, one cannot deny it." "Yes, you squirm. Why? Because Monsieur Wyndham knew something of your debts, perhaps. A debt he threatened to reveal?" Julian's protest died in his throat. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. Evelyn, silent, watched with grave attention. Poirot continued. "It is the same with you all. Each had reason to fear Charles Wyndham. Secrets of money, of honour, of passion. One among you feared him enough to kill. The lies, they betray you. And it is the little detail that will soon tell me which of you wears the shadow of the executioner." The room fell into uneasy silence, the fire crackling softly, shadows wavering on anxious faces. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The storm had passed, yet Greystone Manor seemed no lighter. Its corridors, long and shadowed, bore the weight of suspicion, and the air itself was heavy with something unspoken. Even the servants moved with caution, whispering in corners, glancing quickly over their shoulders. Poirot, small and neat, moved with deliberate calm, as if untouched by the tension that suffocated others. But those who knew him might have noticed the quick sparkle in his eyes, the way his head inclined when a chance word dropped, or the manner in which his fingertips brushed surfaces as though gathering whispers from the wood. That evening he gathered the household once again in the drawing-room. The fire blazed. Outside, the garden lay pale beneath the reluctant moon. Each guest seemed wound tight as a spring. Colonel Redmayne, upright as a parade-ground figure, fiddled with his moustache. Julian Darrow slouched, smoking too quickly. Clara clutched her embroidery frame, though she never threaded the needle. Dr. Grayson polished his spectacles for the third time. Evelyn Harper sat still, her face pale, her hands folded tightly. Lady Margaret presided, austere, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "Mes amis," Poirot began softly. It is in moments such as these that the truth trembles very near the surface. One pushes it down, one hides it beneath lies, beneath pride, beneath silence. But always, always, it rises. He let the silence lengthen. Then, without turning his head, he asked suddenly, "Julian Darrow, you spoke of reading French plays. Yet no such volume is in your room. Where then is this book?" Julian's face darkened. "It has been misplaced. A servant—" Poirot's hand lifted. "Non, monsieur. The servants, they do not read Molière in French. It was a lie. And why? Because you were elsewhere that night. Perhaps in the gallery? Perhaps meeting Wyndham, to beg for mercy concerning your debts." Julian half rose, his voice sharp with anger. "This is outrageous. You accuse me of murder without proof." Lady Margaret's voice cut across, cold and precise. "Be seated, Julian," he obeyed, but his hand shook as he stubbed out his cigarette. Poirot turned then to Clara. "And you, mademoiselle? You said you drank the doctor's draught and slept, but Mary saw you in the corridor. Why conceal it?" Clara trembled, her embroidery falling to the carpet. Because I was frightened. I heard something, a sound like dragging. I thought—" She broke off, eyes wide. "You thought what, mademoiselle?" Poirot pressed gently. She wrung her hands. "That it was him, Mr. Wyndham, arguing with someone. I did not see who, but I was afraid to say so. If I admitted it, you would think I had—" She broke into sobs, her composure unravelled. Colonel Redmayne's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "This is disgraceful," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Poirot allowed Clara's tears to fall, then addressed Dr. Grayson. "Doctor, you're a man accustomed to detail. Yet you lied about the draught. You said she drank it all, but it was poured away. Why hide this?" Grayson's face twitched, and for the first time his voice faltered. Because I feared it would be thought I was negligent. I prescribed it. I gave it into her hands. If she discarded it, then what sort of physician am I? And more—" His voice dropped. "I did not want it known that she confided her fears to me. She said Wyndham had threatened her." Clara gasped, lifting her head. "I never said—" "You implied enough," Grayson snapped, the mask of calm cracking at last. "You told me he pressed you, that he would ruin your name if you refused him. Do you deny it?" Clara's sobs turned sharp, almost hysterical. "I didn't kill him. I only wanted him to stop. He was vile. Vile!" Julian lurched to his feet again. "Clara, for God's sake!" But Lady Margaret rose too, tall and commanding. Her voice was quiet, but it carried like steel. "Enough." The silence that followed was more damning than any shout. Clara sat, collapsed against the sofa cushions, her tears unchecked. Julian's face was pale and drawn, his defiance withering. Dr. Grayson's hands trembled as he replaced his spectacles. Even Colonel Redmayne's moustache sagged a little, as though dismayed by the revelation. Poirot looked around the circle, his eyes gleaming. Voila! The emotions, they betray more than the words. Already we see the lies unravel. Wyndham had enemies, many enemies, beneath this roof. Each of you had cause to fear him. Each of you concealed truths. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he said very softly, "But only one of you is a murderer. And soon the mask will fall." Chapter 9. The Trap. The next day dawned cold and clear, the rain-washed sky brittle with pale sunlight. Yet inside Greystone Manor the atmosphere had not lifted. It seemed instead that the house had grown heavier, its ancient stones weighted by silence and suspicion. No one moved freely now. Doors were opened cautiously. Footsteps faltered on the stair. Each face bore the taut look of one who waits for accusation, for exposure, for the sharp edge of truth. Poirot spent the morning in quiet wanderings, his small, fastidious figure appearing suddenly in unexpected places: the gallery, the library, the smoking room, the servants' passage. He touched nothing, but his eyes missed nothing. By noon he had satisfied himself. At precisely 6 o'clock, as twilight drew shadows into the corners of the great hall, Poirot summoned the household to the drawing-room. The fire was lit, throwing restless light on the carved panelling. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle. The arrangement reminded more than one of the guests of a courtroom, though none dared voice the thought. Lady Margaret entered last, her silver hair gleaming, her expression grave. She took her seat without question. Poirot, immaculate as ever, stood before the fire with his hands neatly folded. His voice, when it came, was soft yet commanding. Mes amis, the moment has arrived. The shadow of the executioner lies across this house, and I have followed it to its source. You think you have hidden your secrets, but murder, always, will out. He let his eyes sweep over them. Last night I set a small trap. I asked Mary, the maid, to polish once more the floor of the gallery. Ah, but only in one place, beneath the beam where Wyndham was hanged. And then I left the rope where it still dangled. I wished to see. Who among you could not resist? Who would return in the night, compelled by guilt or by fear that some trace had been overlooked? A sharp intake of breath ran round the room. Clara's hands flew to her mouth. Julian shifted violently in his chair. Colonel Redmayne's eyes narrowed. Evelyn Harper alone sat utterly still, her gaze fixed on Poirot. This morning, Poirot continued, I found the wax disturbed again. A fresh mark, very slight, where a shoe had slipped in haste, and, upon the rope, a thread of cloth not there before, dark green wool of a kind not common, and who in this house wears such wool? His eyes rested upon Julian Darrow. Julian paled, his lips parting in protest. This is madness. You cannot condemn me for a thread of cloth. Non, monsieur, Poirot said gently. The cloth alone is not enough. But when combined with your debts which Wyndham threatened to expose, it becomes most telling. You lied about the French book, because you were not reading at all. You were meeting Wyndham here in the gallery that night. You begged him for silence. He refused, and so you silenced him. Julian sprang to his feet. That's a lie. You can't prove it. Poirot's gaze sharpened. But I can. You see, Wyndham was not killed where he was found. He was attacked first, struck from behind with the brass candlestick that now lies hidden behind the curtain. He was unconscious when the rope was placed about his neck. The knot, too perfect for a panicked man, was tied with care. And then the scene was arranged to resemble suicide. But the details, they betray you. Julian's face contorted. Clara gave a little cry. Julian, no, but Poirot raised a hand. Not so fast, mademoiselle. For though your brother is guilty of deceit, he is not guilty of murder. The blow with the candlestick was struck not by him, but by another. He was here, yes, and he lied to protect himself. But the hand that tied the knot, that hand belonged to someone else entirely. Someone with knowledge of knots, of anatomy. Someone calm enough to arrange the scene with precision. All eyes turned as one to Dr. Grayson. The doctor's hand trembled upon his spectacles. His lips moved soundlessly. Poirot's voice dropped to a silken whisper. Doctor, you told us you slept, that you were unwell. Yet your boots bear traces of wax from the gallery floor, and you, more than any, had reason to fear Wyndham's tongue. He knew of your indiscretion, those prescriptions unaccounted for, those fees taken without record. He would have ruined you. Grayson's face crumpled. He blackmailed me, he whispered. For months he bled me dry. I could not endure it. Clara gasped. Lady Margaret closed her eyes. Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. Poirot inclined his head gravely. So you killed him? You struck him senseless. You tied the rope. You moved the chair. You thought the storm would cover the sounds. The shadows would conceal the details. But always there is one detail too many. And for you, it was the knot. The executioner's knot tied too perfectly. A doctor's hand, monsieur, not a desperate man's. The room was utterly still. The fire hissed, and into that silence fell Doctor. Grayson's voice, broken, almost childlike. Yes, he said, it is true. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The silence in the drawing room was thick, oppressive. Every face was fixed upon Doctor Grayson, whose hands shook upon the arms of his chair. He looked smaller now, diminished, as though the admission had drawn all strength from him. Yet Poirot, standing so neat and self-possessed before the fire, did not allow the moment to close too soon. His eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, but also with that grave solemnity which death demands. Alors, he said softly, it is finished. Yet I will speak. so that all may understand, and so that no shadow remains. He drew himself up and with the precision of a barrister addressing a jury began. Monsieur Wyndham, he was a man who collected secrets. He knew of Julian's debts and threatened exposure. He tormented Mademoiselle Clara with insinuations that would have ruined her reputation. He toyed with knowledge of Colonel Redmayne's past, an indiscretion during his service, perhaps best left unspoken. Even Lady Margaret he pressed with legal contrivances. He was a spider at the centre of this web pulling the threads, but above all he preyed upon Dr. Grayson. For months, you paid him to keep silent about your, shall we say, questionable practices in accounts and prescriptions. You had much to lose, and when Wyndham pressed harder, when he threatened to speak to the authorities, you resolved to end the threat. Grayson's lips moved. He left me no choice. There is always a choice, Poirot said sharply, but you chose murder. He lifted a finger. On that stormy night, Wyndham came to the gallery, perhaps to think, perhaps to gloat. You followed. Words were exchanged. You struck him down with the candlestick. He fell, stunned. Then, with the calm of the physician, you placed the rope about his neck. You tied the hangman's knot. Ah, too perfect, too professional. You arranged the chair, and to mislead us further, you interfered with the bell wire, ensuring the flag fell to suggest the victim himself had called. You thought all was complete, but the details, always the details, they betrayed you. He began to tick them off, one by one, his voice rising. The chair, wrongly placed, not where a desperate man would leave it. The wax smeared before the chair was moved. The rope, cut from the curtain, leaving its twin behind. The knot, too precise, not the work of panic. And your boots, monsieur, bearing the trace of polish from the gallery floor. Poirot's hand dropped, final as a judge's gavel. Thus the truth was clear. It was you, Dr. Grayson, who played the executioner. Clara stifled a sob. Julian stared as though dazed. Colonel Redmayne gave a sharp, involuntary nod, like a soldier acknowledging an unanswerable order. Lady Margaret's expression did not change, though her eyes were fierce. Evelyn Harper alone leaned forward, her gaze steady upon Poirot, as though committing every word to memory. Grayson's shoulders sagged. You cannot understand. He ruined me slowly. Each month another payment. Each week another threat. I thought one act of courage, one moment, and I should be free. Courage? Poirot's eyes flashed. Non, monsieur. Murder is never courage. It is the refuge of weakness. You chose to kill because you lack the strength to endure disgrace. Yet now, you will face disgrace still, and justice with it. The doctor covered his face with his hands. His confession hung in the room like a pall. At length, Lady Margaret rose. Sergeant Hollis, she said quietly, you know your duty. Hollis stepped forward, his expression grave, and laid a hand upon the doctor's shoulder. Grayson did not resist. He rose slowly like an old man and allowed himself to be led away. For a long moment after, no one spoke. Then Poirot cleared his throat gently. And so, mesdames et messieurs, it is done. The shadow of the executioner has been lifted. Wyndham is avenged, though not by violence, but by truth. He turned toward the fire, his small form outlined against the flames. It is always the same. One believes that by striking swiftly, one may end the threat. But crime, crime is like a shadow. It clings, it lengthens, it darkens all it touches. Only by the little grey cells, by the order and the logic can we dispel it. He bowed slightly to Lady Margaret, then to the company at large. I thank you for your patience. My work here is finished. And with that, Hercule Poirot, immaculate and serene, took up his hat and gloves. He departed into the clear night, leaving behind a house forever changed, and a truth that could no longer be denied. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The household at Greystone Manor never forgot the days that followed. The authorities came, quietly efficient, their motor cars crunching over the gravel in the pale light of dawn. Dr. Grayson was taken away without protest. His figure stooped, his eyes hollow, as though he had aged years in a single night. The scandal was discreet, for Lady Margaret had influence enough to ensure that newspapers spoke only of an unfortunate tragedy. Yet within the village whispers ran like quicksilver. Clara, pale but calmer now, avoided the gaze of strangers, her youthful vivacity dimmed by all she had witnessed. Julian retreated to London under the pretext of business, his debts still looming, though he had gained a reprieve from Wyndham's threats. Colonel Redmayne remained at Greystone for a short time, pacing the terrace with soldierly impatience, before departing with stiff courtesy. Lady Margaret herself held the household together with her customary dignity, though those who looked closely saw lines of weariness deeper etched upon her face. Evelyn Harper stayed faithfully at her side, her composure undisturbed, her devotion quietly unshaken. Poirot lingered only 2 more days. He spent them in the library, sometimes walking the grounds, always thoughtful. He was courteous to all, yet it was clear that his mind had turned inward, occupied less with persons than with principles. On his final evening he sat with Lady Margaret and Evelyn in the withdrawing-room. The fire burned low, and the shadows lengthened. After a time, Lady Margaret spoke. "You have restored order, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "For that, I thank you. Yet order seems a poor thing when one has lived through such ugliness." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "It is the way of crime, madame. It brings disorder first to the heart, then to the house. To restore order is all one may do. But it is not everything." Evelyn, who had been silent, asked softly, "What is missing, monsieur?" He smiled at her, the faint wry smile of a man who has seen much. "Compassion, mademoiselle. Always there must be compassion. We judge, we condemn, we punish, yes. But we must also understand. Dr. Grayson was weak, not wicked. He yielded where he should have stood firm. His crime was monstrous, yet he was no monster. That distinction, it is important Lady Margaret regarded him closely. You speak as though justice alone is insufficient." Poirot spread his hands. "Justice, madam, is blind. But truth sees all, and sometimes it is more cruel than justice itself, for justice punishes the deed, truth lays bare the soul." The fire crackled softly. Evelyn's gaze rested on him, solemn and admiring. "And you, monsieur, you're not only a seeker of justice, but of truth." Poirot bowed his head modestly. "It is my little gift, mademoiselle. To see what others overlook, to piece together what others discard. It is not brilliance. It is only order, method, the little grey cells. But without order, the world falls into chaos, and Hercule Poirot, he cannot endure chaos." Lady Margaret's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Then may the world ever have need of your grey cells, monsieur." He rose then, smoothing his coat, and took up his hat. At the door he paused, looking back at the 2 women framed by the firelight, the proud lady and the quiet companion. His voice was gentle. "Greystone will heal, madam. Shadows pass, but stone endures. Remember only this. The truth, once revealed, does not destroy. It purifies. Even here, where an executioner's shadow fell, the light returns." He bowed once more, and then was gone, his neat figure vanishing into the hall. The echo of his precise footsteps lingered, steady and unhurried, until the door closed and the night air swallowed the sound. At Greystone, life resumed, though never as before, and somewhere beyond the rolling countryside Hercule Poirot moved on to his next case, leaving behind order wrested from disorder, and a household forever altered by the sharp, unyielding light of truth. Chapter 12. The Quiet Exit. The morning of Poirot's departure was pale and chill, with a low mist curling along the lawns of Greystone Manor. The house seemed exhausted after its days of strain, like an old creature that had weathered a storm and now sought only silence. Servants moved with unusual care, voices hushed, their eyes sliding toward the door where the detective's luggage had been neatly placed. Poirot himself appeared precisely at 8 o'clock, attired in a grey suit so immaculate that not a crease betrayed travel. His hat was brushed, his gloves spotless, his moustaches gleaming as though polished for ceremony. He moved through the hall with that curious air of self-possession which seemed to create its own stillness. Lady Margaret was waiting for him at the foot of the staircase. She extended her hand, her expression grave. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you have done more than solve a crime. You have saved this house from ruin of another kind, the slow ruin of suspicion. I am in your debt." Poirot bowed over her hand with old-world grace. "Non, madame. You're in debt only to truth. I was but its servant." Evelyn Harper came forward then, quiet as always, her eyes dark with something that might have been gratitude or perhaps understanding. She said softly, "We shall not forget you." Poirot regarded her with a faint smile. "Mademoiselle, it is well. For you have the gift of memory. You notice, you observe, it will serve you in life. But remember also this, observation without compassion becomes cruelty. You saw much, and you held your peace. That was wisdom." She bowed her head, a flush rising to her cheeks. Julian Darrow appeared in the doorway, pale and chastened. He managed a stiff nod. Clara, hovering behind, gave Poirot a tremulous smile, her eyes red-rimmed but steadier than before. Even Colonel Redmayne, gruff and unwilling, muttered, "My respect, sir," as if conceding victory to a rival officer. Poirot accepted each acknowledgement with a small inclination of the head, never smug, never yielding more than courtesy. For him, the case was closed, and with it, his interest. The motor car arrived, its engine thrumming softly in the mist. Poirot allowed the chauffeur to stow his cases, then turned for one last glance at the great house. Its windows loomed solemn, reflecting only the pale sky. He spoke, half to himself, half to those gathered. So it ends. The executioner's shadow has passed, yet it leaves behind its mark. Remember, mes amis, that crime is born always of weakness, of fear, of the little secret cherished too long. One guards a lie, and in guarding it, one destroys oneself. Lady Margaret's voice was low. "And truth, monsieur, what does it do?" Poirot's eyes softened. "Truth, madam, wounds at first, but it heals. It clears the air as a storm clears the sky. That is why Hercule Poirot serves not men, not law, but truth. It is the only master that never deceives." He raised his hat, stepped into the car, and with a precise nod was gone. The motor car rolled down the drive, its wheels crunching on the gravel, then vanished into the mist. For a time those left on the steps stood silently, listening to the receding sound. Then, one by one, they turned back into the house. Life, though altered, resumed. And far away, in the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot, another puzzle already stirred, waiting for its hour.